Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin shortly. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. Joining us today to discuss religion during and after coronavirus is Rabbi David Wolpe, named America's Most Influential Rabbi by Newsweek, and Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, the first woman to head the venerable 184-year-old Union Theological Seminary. Rabbi Wolpe and Reverend Dr. Jones will be in conversation with Rabbi Noam Marans, AJC Director of Interreligious and Intergroup Relations. After we hear from our esteemed guest, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Noam, you and our esteemed guests have the floor.
Thank you very much, Daniel. What a treat, a delight to bring together two longtime friend colleagues over many decades, Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, the president of Union, Rabbi David Wolpe, the senior rabbi at Sinai Temple, both of whom have great reach beyond their institutions and have helped generations of strivers to deal with the greatest religious questions of our time. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be a part of this conversation, Rabbi. I'm so thrilled to be here and so honored to be in this conversation with AJC and with both of you.
And I feel the same. It's wonderful to be with you. And I'm glad that we overcame early technical glitches to actually get here on my part. So thank you. Thank you for your help and thank you for your invitation.
So let's get into it. Of course, we're speaking about COVID-19, coronavirus, the pandemic, the greatest health challenge of our lifetimes, a transformational event that has its impact on all avenues of life, including faith, religion, synagogue, church, all manifestations in many areas of our lives. And there have been moments of greatness, of gratitude for the frontline workers, the heroes, not only in the hospitals and the EMTs, but all those who allow us to do everything that we do every day in order to survive as a society. Teachers who are figuring out how to do it in a different way, and rabbis, ministers, imams, and others. I'd like us to begin, though, not with the power of overcoming, but with the reality of loss. Both of you have written powerfully about loss and trauma. Rabbi Wolpe's best-selling book, Making Loss Matter, Creating Meaning in Difficult Times. Dr. Jones's, what I would call a theological memoir, which she subtitles Finding Meaning in a Fractured World. So, dear religious thinkers, what do we do with all of this loss? Loss of life, loss of health, loss of job and food security, loss of opportunities, loss of everything that we do normally in separating between home and work, loss of our ability to celebrate and mourn in the normal ways. Let's begin with you, Serene.
Well, that's such a good place to start, because these conversations about COVID and where we're going, if we don't pause and take in the magnitude of the moment that we're in, then those conversations about the future sort of seem flighty and not grounded. And the reality that we're grounded in now is a reality of loss, the magnitude and a seriousness and a scope of which in my lifetime, we haven't seen anything like it. And I think it's going to actually take us a couple of years to even begin to comprehend the magnitude of that loss. So my experience with grief and with mourning is it's oftentimes when you're in the middle of it, the shock of it is so strong, it's hard to even recognize what it is you're grieving. And I think we're in one of those moments. And so simply recognizing that sometimes the numbness and the confusion or what comes across as just grumpiness or irritability or despair, inability to get out of bed, it comes across as depression. All of those are signs of how we are as a people coping with the fact that all of the things that made our lives rhythm seem normal to us have been turned upside down and shaken out. And that's true for a person who has not directly lost a loved one to COVID or themselves had it. It's even more acutely true for those who have suffered direct losses. And it's particularly true for whole communities and whole households, which have been disproportionately wiped out by this pandemic. And so part of reckoning with the loss is reckoning also with the disproportionate character of the loss and how in many communities in the United States, it's uncovering decades and decades of loss that have been compounded to create very significant and severe losses.
I think that that's, first of all, a very wise and important place to start. That is, acknowledgement precedes almost anything else. And also confusion precedes understanding. And as Dr. Jones said, we don't know, even those of us that think we know what we've lost, it's very hard to reckon what we've lost. By the way, it's also hard to reckon what we've gained. That is, the things that will come out of this that will be good or beneficial, some of which we can guess at, may be very different. I've been very impressed, as I suspect you both have, with the inability of human beings to predict the future. We do it all the time, but we're almost always wrong, and usually radically wrong. And people who say this is what the post-COVID world will be like, the only thing I can say to them is, I promise you'll be wrong, whatever it is. Maybe you get a little piece right. But so our sense of what it is that we've lost now may in fact transform. It may be different from what we think, or it may take a different character from what we think. And ultimately the question will be not what we could have done, although that's important in order to prevent similar catastrophes in the future, but what will we do with the loss that was inevitable in our lives? You can't help losing your job if the economy is shut down. The question is, what will you do with it inside yourself and in the world? Because people are discovering that they need a certain internal resolution and resource that they never needed in their lives before. And so it is a difficult time and a testing time, and nobody knows either the questions or the answers yet.
The only thing that we are certain of is the magnitude of the loss. And one of the things that is clear is that loss permeates the entire experience regardless of the severity or the rationalism of the loss. It's the loss of life, the loss of health, and the seemingly minute loss of a graduation relative to those others, but yet they are very real and need to be managed in order to have a healthy life.
I just want to add one note, exactly corroborating what you said, which is no matter what you're losing, and this is true in life in general, there's always someone who has it worse. And so to say, for example, to a child who's missing their graduation, but at least, you have a safe home and meals and so on, that's true. And there should absolutely be an element of tremendous gratitude in those of us who are lucky enough so far to be able to make it through with health. But that doesn't mean you haven't lost. And you're allowed to have a certain amount of self-forgiveness about the fact that you feel bad for yourself, even though someone else over there has it worse. You can feel both. You can feel grateful and grieved. They're not necessarily opposed to each other. And so the one word that I would counsel all of us who are dealing with all of each other's loss is patience.
Yes, and one of the worst things you can do is, out of guilt about comparing your suffering to others, is to repress your own grief and to act as if there isn't loss there, because that will make you completely unable to engage and move forward. And just another angle on loss that I've been struck by is during this time of isolation, I have become aware of so many things that I had never taken time to grieve that I lost before COVID, but in a world that was moving so quickly and so fast, going here and there, and the rapid pace of life, that old griefs were coming forward in the quiet and the silence of the time that this has created. And so I think in this moment, past grieving comes to the fore too, and it collects itself around us and gives us a chance to learn from it.
I think as rabbis, we've probably noticed every grief recalls, exactly as Dr. Jones said, every other grief. There's no grief stops and then comes along. That's part of the myth of closure. Okay, I'm done with that grief. Now I'll work on this one. No, it reopens the same things inside you. And so you grieve multiple times with each new grief.
If we have time a little bit later, I want to come back to the issue of loss and the specific responses of our religious traditions to loss. But I want to turn to a different place now and have you speak about our religious institutions and structures. I think that in terms of faith and religion and tradition, the most challenging issue has been the loss of our physical buildings, which we relied upon as the primary vehicles, rightly or wrongly, to create community, faith, ritual, traditions. So we all know this. We have not been able to get inside our synagogues, our churches, our mosques, our gurdwaras, our temples, to perform our celebrations, our rituals, most notably our mourning practices that are so essential in religious psychology and self-understanding. We got through Passover, we got through Easter. Muslims are now celebrating Ramadan. We just had a program on this that was featuring 2 members of AJC's founded Muslim Jewish Advisory Council, of which Rabbi David Wolpe is a member as well. All of us are going through this together. So David, you have the first perch here, the rabbi of a major synagogue in the United States, where you are trying, together with your team, to run a synagogue on a model that is completely unfamiliar to you, and yet maybe has created familiarity. So tell us about that, and tell us what you're thinking about for the high holidays.
Well, so I actually wrote an article about this that's coming out this week for The Atlantic, about what it's like to do a funeral with 6 people standing around the grave in masks, and what it's like to think about when we will come back together again, because Judaism is very much characterized by community, in some ways as a priority even, over specific belief. A house of worship in Hebrew is called a house of congregation, not a house of worship. And there are certain prayers, including the prayer for mourning, that you can't do without a certain number of people there. So this is for us really a blow at the heart of who we are and what we are. And I think we're trying as best we can. Like every church, mosque, synagogue, house of worship in the country, maybe in the world, to substitute with some online stuff that which we can't do in person. And online widens and shallows your community. That is, anybody can join, but they can also turn away at any moment. And it loses the organic and authentic connection that you have in person. So what I think of this in some ways as a stopgap measure. I mean, on the high holidays, I think it's virtually certain that no congregation is going to be able to gather. We have 5,000 people in this building on the high holidays. We're not doing that this year. And the advantage of this, by the way, is that I've spoken to more rabbis and pastors over the past month than I have in the past 5 years, because all of us are trying to figure out the same dilemmas. I would say that what it comes down to is we're trying to preserve our authenticity as much and as long as we can until we can be fully authentic again. That's what's really going on, is we're trying not to lose people and to give them genuine content and to hold them as close as we can. Because as I say in the article, a woman called me about the fact that she lost a parent and she wanted to sit Shiva, which is the Jewish mourning practice of 7 days. And she said, the first thing about sitting Shiva is you stay home, right? And I said, yes. And she goes, like everybody in the world. And I said, yes, the entire world right now is sitting Shiva. There's a certain element of mourning, no matter what you do online, from the fact that you're home. And we will see what the world will be like when we can go out again.
Thank you, David. Serene, you have multiple perspectives. Your primary perspective is as the head of the preeminent theological school, training Christians, diverse Christians. And this is clearly having an impact on their formation as future religious leaders in America. You also are in contact with American Christianity in its diversity. You also are a churchgoer yourself. So how are you processing this? What has been lost? What has been gained? What will stay? What will last, notwithstanding Rabbi Wolpe's warning that we not predict? Serene.
I have only three things to say. First, I just want to acknowledge, which is that at first was my primary feeling, and it's still deeply there, and that is a sense of loss as a teacher and as a pastor. No matter what you do to try to make Zoom personal, in smaller groups, larger groups, however you try to do it, nothing makes up for being face-to-face with people. Especially when you're praying together, when you're eating together, when you're being community together. And I think that one of the things that this has made us aware of is how important that is. And at times it's easy to take for granted just the physicality of our faith and the energy that flows between us when we are actually physically connected to one another. But the second thing is that I have reflected a lot on the fact that evangelical Americans have been doing online virtual education and worship service for quite some time. In fact, they're way ahead of the curve than the students and faculty at Union and the more liberal Protestant denominations that I work with, and have had mega churches that do their primary work online. Now, most of evangelical America also combines that with some face-to-face interaction. But just to say that there is a history there of a religious community going out in that direction. But the third thing that I have realized at Union is, so when we first realized that we needed to shut the school for 2 days and then start again remotely. So we had 2 days warning. This was in March. We rushed and we did the best we could immediately because we were really in dire situation in the middle of New York City, and we couldn't afford to do it any other way. But this summer, we have 3 months to think about how to do it best and to develop a new set of best practices and to try to wean ourselves from the view that anything that we do online is going to be a fall away and less than and somehow inadequate compared to what we really should be doing, and to adopt the view that, in fact, isn't it amazing that we can do this, and how can we do it better? And how can we reach people? What do people need? We're learning very quickly that you only have so much attention for Zoom, and there has to be very many different ways of communicating with people online than that. So I'm excited about what the next several months are going to teach us about ways of connecting online that we weren't aware of before. At least I wasn't, and I have a big learning curve.
I want to add one footnote to that because it's something that I learned at Union Theological Seminary. When I was a student at the Jewish Theological Seminary, you could take courses at Union. And I took a course with the wonderful, wonderful church historian, wonderful man, Robert Handy. And he, in his class, he showed us again and again how churches in America reinvented themselves. And it seemed like it was the end of the line for this, and then all of a sudden there was a swerve and something new happened. That's certainly been true in my own tradition, and I think that that's what we're hearing now, is we're going to have to reinvent ourselves again, and a future historian will teach.
Yes. And throughout it, we have to believe God that we are worshiping is much bigger and powerful and all-encompassing than our ongoing attempts to find ways to worship together.
So I want to make sure we have enough time for a very important topic, and in some way, Rabbi Wolpe David unintendedly set it up for me, which is the topic of anti-Semitism in the context of COVID-19, and I'll explain my cryptic allusion. One of the things that the three of us have in common is that we have spent a lot of time on Morningside Heights in New York, the campuses of Columbia, the Jewish Theological Seminary, where David and I and multiple members over multiple generations of our families were ordained. And of course, across the street, Union Theological Seminary, the bastion of liberal Protestantism, and the place where Serene is currently president. And why is this relevant to the topic of anti-Semitism during COVID-19? You see that AJC turned to the Jewish Theological Seminary, specifically Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was recruited by my legendary predecessor, Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum, and played a critical role together with AJC in helping to shape and be involved in the process that led to Nostra Aetate, the transformational document that forever changed Catholic and implicitly Christian understandings of Jews and Judaism. It was the beginning of the process. But earlier, in the 1950s, Heschel was already doing that at Union. He was doing it with Reinhold Niebuhr. And a legendary story as well that is not as fully told as it should be, but it's relevant to this moment. Why? Because that entire process over decades of Christians reconciling with their anti-Jewish past and finding a new way forward actually succeeded for 2 generations. And now, notwithstanding that commitment by Christians to combat anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, the world is slipping back into its earlier time. At the beginning of the 21st century, we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism, first primarily in Europe, elsewhere in the world. It's a fatal form of anti-Semitism, and now here in the United States, to the shock of many, I'm sure, Rabbi Wolpe and me, on the magnitude of the level that we did not think we would experience in our lifetimes after decades of achievements on the part of the American Jewish community. So let me begin with you, Serene. We now see protests, for example, against restrictions, stay-at-home restrictions during COVID-19 that are directed at the governor of Illinois, for example, J.B. Pritzker, a Jew, with a sign, Arbeit macht frei. Work will set you free, the ignoble words at the entrance to Auschwitz. What are we not doing right in America, in the world, that anti-Semitism is back in this way?
Such
Serene.
an important, to even begin to reach into that that murky world of this present moment is mighty. It's a mighty task. First of all, though, I think that we need to remember the gains that we have made and the bonds that are there, because the strength of those bonds is very strong, and that will be what pulls us forward. As a Christian, any Christian who comes out of Union Theological Seminary knows the anti-Semitism that we're experiencing, even if it's coming from people who are not overtly Christian, probably don't go to church every Sunday, it nonetheless has its roots deep within Christianity. And as we know from the history of Christianity, anti-Semitism flares its awful head in times of plague and in times of economic downturn and in times of tension. And it's much easier for Christians to turn and blame it on a figure of the Jew. It's happened time and time and time again. It repeats itself so often. It's almost like a cliche stuck in the Christian imagination that this is where the impulse goes towards hatred. And that is the thing that we need to cut off. That is the thing that our schools, our seminaries, our churches need to be talking about, need to be naming the instances of anti-Semitism as they happen, calling them what they are, calling them anti-Semitism, and taking action against them. And not pretending like, oh, this is just a small group of right-wing extremists who happen to be saying anti-Semitic things again, because the resonances of anti-Semitism roll around the imagination of Christian America, even in its most liberal forms, all the time. Our sins of the past haunt us constantly as Christians, and they are not sins that we can afford to relax and pretend like they are not still haunting us.
David?
The one thing that is important to understand is that anti-Semitism is a protean hatred. You can hate Jews for being capitalists, and you can hate Jews for being communists. You can hate Jews for being weak and submissive, and you can hate Jews for being fighting and dominant. You can hate Jews for being assimilating and disappearing, and you can hate Jews for being distinct and refusing to being absorbed into the majority culture. You can hate Jews for ruling the world, and you can hate Jews for being subhuman. There is no trope of any kind of hatred that hasn't been applied to the Jews. And that being the case, one of the things to understand, and this will displease some of your viewers, I'm sure, is that both right and left in America right now and around the world have serious things to answer for. And what I look for is not the left yelling at the right about their anti-Semitism, or the right yelling at the left about their anti-Semitism. I want to see people on the side of the politics they support yelling at their own. And that's what's not happening. I want to see the people called out in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party who say brutal and cruel things about Jews and Israel. And I want to see supporters of the president call out the things that he and people around him have said that give aid and comfort to right-wing extremists. And until you're prepared to do that, I don't take your concern about anti-Semitism seriously. Because if it's only a club to beat your opponents, then you don't actually care about anti-Semitism. And you heard, for example, what Dr. Jones said herself. She said, as the head of a liberal seminary, this is something that rattles around liberal as well as conservative America. That's exactly what we need to hear. We need to hear everybody taking responsibility for their own, not using it as a means to say the other guy is lousy. And unfortunately, we are so polarized and so angry at one another in the political sphere that I don't see that happening.
Serene, we have a moment for you to add to this part of the conversation if you'd like.
No, I mean, I absolutely agree that that anti-Semitism should not be like a volleyball that's thrown back and forth from one side to the other as an accusation, because the deepest work that has to be done is internal to the communities themselves, because that is where it rumbles around. And until it's addressed at that level, until you are talking about it to your next door neighbor who is your friend, and calling the anti-Semitism into question in what they've said, and even in what you have imagined in your own mind and been surprised by, until it takes place at that level, you're not really addressing. It's just a surface game that uses another weapon to polarize our nation and polarize our world.
In addition to the political polarization, we also have, since this is a religious conversation, we have religious extremism and polarization. Of course, we have extremism in the name of Islam that has been fatal to Jews in Europe, among other places. And we have extremism in the name of Christianity that has been the underbelly, astonishingly and disappointingly, in some of the anti-Semitism in the United States. Those who are pushing the hate are often doing it in a Christian context, Serene. Am I right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, no. I mean, it's hard to call it a Christian context because the extreme right, you'll rarely see them in church, or even, and I'm say controversial things here, but even familiar with the Bible, or even having any regular religious practice. But, quote, to be Christian has become a cultural name for being white and being, in these cases, extremists. And it's tied up with anti-Semitism. It's also tied up with hatred of women. It's tied up with white supremacy. They're all nested in there together, which this nation has become altogether connected with some sort of violent nostalgia for a world that never was. And the theological underpinnings of that, which give it its moral righteousness, is what makes it most frightening of all. Because when you take a set of political views and then you give them, even if you're totally incorrect in how you read it, but if you give them religious roots, then nothing can stop you, because you believe that God is on your side. And the self-righteousness that grows out of that is something that any religious person should be aware of and afraid of happening, because the tendency towards it is so strong.
Can I want to amplify that in the following way. The way I think of religion is it's a force multiplier. That is, whatever belief you have, if it has a religious context, it gives it additional strength. It's one of the reasons why all over the world, the greatest aid agencies, the most self-sacrificing aid workers tend to be religious workers, because they have that belief, and then it's a force multiplier. I remember once I helped a friend of mine building an orphanage in Haiti, and every aid worker I found was a Christian aid worker. It was astonishing, some of whom had been there decades building houses, because the regular aid workers would go back, but they felt that this was a religious mission. So when your message is a message of hate for whatever reason, or you have deep anger in you, and then it becomes religious, it's a force multiplier in a bad way. And that's what we have to watch out for, is whatever you believe, if you add a religious cast to it, it makes it stronger. It makes good gooder, if you will, and it makes bad badder.
Thank you both. Before we go to questions in just a moment, I want each of you to help us with a 30 to 45-second answer back to the question of loss. What is it in our respective traditions that can help us with loss? It can be a verse, it can be a concept, it can be a tradition. What would that be among many others, David, in our tradition, and Serene, in your tradition?
I'll tell you one of my favorite stories that I heard years ago about a man who looks up at the heavens and says, God, there's so much pain and difficulty and suffering in your world. Why don't you send help? And God says, I did send help. I sent you. And that idea, the idea that you are actually empowered to make it better, is the best way to deal with loss. You can't deal with loss by making it go away, because it doesn't go away. And you can't grieve forever. Remember the famous Psalm says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And I remember in rabbinical school, our teacher telling us the most important word in that Psalm was walk. You don't stay in the valley of the shadow of death. You keep walking. And so if we are able to reach out and help others, even in small ways, I think that is the best way we know to deal with loss. It doesn't make it go away, but it makes it meaningful.
Serene, thank you, David.
Thank you. That's beautiful. For me, when I think about loss and trauma and grief, I always go to the Psalms. We find in the Psalms an anatomy of all parts of the soul, as John Calvin once put it. And you find the full range of human emotion there, the deepest of which is grief, and along with grief and loss, all of the anger and the horror that goes with that. One of the things I often tell my students that's important about the Psalms is some of the Psalms are not very nice at all. I mean, they are harsh, and they are like a expulsion of all of the human rage and the tearing and renting of your clothes and the pulling of your hair and the anger you feel at people around you. And it acknowledges that we're human beings and that loss is devastating. And yet the Psalms, even in the middle of that devastation, does not cease to lift up prayers and praise to God. And as the Psalms evolve, you find yourself in all of that pain, traveling a road back to a life of connection and community where there is love.
Thank you both. And now we're going to turn to Daniel. I bet there are some questions out there.
We do. We have quite a lot of questions. And just as a reminder, if you have a question, you can email questions@ajc.org or respond in the Q&A feature in Zoom. So our first question actually comes through the Q&A function in Zoom. Rabbi Wolpe, to you first, what is your concern that when this pandemic has passed, that Americans will not return to our physical religious structures? And with the new distancing lifestyle that awaits us, from a practical standpoint, such large groups of congregants and the need for such distancing will not make our traditional matter of prayer practical nor desirable for a large percentage of Americans, especially the older Americans.
I'm deeply concerned about it. And I don't have an answer to what will happen, because as you say, first of all, it's going to be a long time, I think. I mean, barring some miraculous, ubiquitous vaccine that seems at least a ways off, it's going to be a very long time before everybody feels comfortable congregating again. And even then, they will have been introduced to a new way to relate to one another. And I don't know if they will universally abandon sweatpants and couches and Zoom. We at Sinai, which is my synagogue in Los Angeles, we, in our centennial book, it talks about what happened in 1918, believe it or not. The synagogue was shuttered for 2 months. And when it was open, people rushed back in, anxious to pray again. It was a different world, though. Synagogue attendance then was not on the decline, as it tends to be now. There were not technological alternatives. So I don't know what that will mean. having said that, let me just end by saying that the reason that we keep reading the Bible in part is because everything has changed since ancient times. Everything, food, language, culture, everything except human nature. And human beings need one another. There is a deep hunger for human connection. And so I'm counting on that deep hunger that has never changed for people to seek each other again in person, in synagogue, in prayer.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Bill in upstate New York. The environment that we are facing has created a lot of time for reflection. And thinking about the new world that will come out of this crisis, what can both of your faith communities do to learn more about the other and do more with one another? So, Dr. Jones?
Yes, it has given us a lot of time for reflection. And I think paying attention to what comes up as you take time to reflect. Again, I come back to David's statement about what we're learning in our isolation and in our time of reflection is the depth of our need for one another. It's profound, and I've never in my life been this isolated and experienced as strongly my own need for that connection. And what I find is it's not just connection that I need for my family and my daughter and all the people I know who are like me and in my very tight friend group, but what I miss profoundly is interactions with people from worlds that are not my own world, from traditions that are not my traditions, but with whom I share connection and who make my world bigger. And so as we reflect on that loss, the necessity of having these bonds that reach across traditions deeply, and the friendships that come thereof, I think is quite profound. And I think the world on the other side of COVID, as David said, we're not going to lose that need for one another. And we have the possibility of reimagining some of the patterns of how we do it that makes it filled with connections that over time in history have been lost. We can revitalize those connections.
David?
I want to add one additional point to the thrust of the question, which is, this is the first time in human history that everybody has gone through the same thing and knows that everyone else is going through the same thing. There have been worldwide pandemics, but never when there was an internet. Never when we could understand what was going on in Italy in real time when we were in Los Angeles. And it has tied all of humanity together in a unique way. And I hope we don't lose that. This is really a universal experience, which is unique in all of human history and remarkable. I mean, we're all waking up seeing, how did other countries deal with it? What did Sweden do? What did Germany do? That's astonishing if you think about it. And so I hope that will also help religious groups understand that at bottom, you start off as a human being first. And though we have important differences from one another, you know, when at the viral level, we're all in the same boat.
Thank you. Daniel?
Our next question comes from Adi in Tel Aviv, who asked, how have faith leaders helped their communities deal with previous moments of global crisis, and what lessons can we apply today? Dr. Jones, would you like to take that question first?
Faith leaders of the past.
Well, yes, I mean, I would say that there has not been a moment in human history when our religious communities have not been taught and been forced to and been at the very edge and present to people in crisis. Just talking about the Bible itself, it is nothing but one long book about communities in crisis and what it means to have in the midst of it, and how God speaks to people in the midst of crisis. So that is what it means to be religious, is to be present, and to be present to the vicissitudes of the human condition, which includes tragedy, death, crisis, violence, and also all of the wonderful things about love and connection.
You have someone in your tradition, Serene, whom you felt did a pretty good job, or is it one calamity after another?
Well, yes, it is one calamity after another, but there are some who have risen to the occasion more powerfully than others. Union is very proud to claim as one of its esteemed professors, Reinhold Niebuhr, who in times of crisis called Christians and called all people to moral courage, and said when the going gets rough and when our fabric of ourself is tested by our will to hate, by our will to turn away, by our will to neglect, by our will towards violence, that is the moment that is most important for us when our faith comes to the fore and calls us to a different way of life, in which moral courage leads us and connects us to our neighbors and keeps us strong in that way.
Thank you. David.
So I was thinking of your question when you just asked us, who would I pick as a model for somebody who's led us through difficult times? And like Serene, I could pick many different figures, biblical and post-biblical, but in the modern world, I think there's probably nobody who represents what Judaism would have us understand better than Leo Beck, who in Theresienstadt, in the midst of the worst in a concentration camp, elected, when he was given the opportunity to escape, to stay and teach. And he taught Talmud and Plato in the concentration camp because he believed that learning and growing was not the antidote, but the response to tragedy. And so as far as I'm concerned, as I said before, the Jewish tradition doesn't believe that tragedy can be erased or lost before the coming of a Messiah can be eradicated from the world, but that your response to it is the measure of your life. And for those of you who want to read a book that I think exemplifies this, and one of those few books that all human beings should read, it's Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, about his time in the camps. It's a short book, and about his recognition that the great struggle in human life is not for happiness, it's for meaning. And if you have a sense that your life serves a purpose, especially a purpose that is greater than you, then it puts loss in a completely different kind of perspective in your life.
A very helpful prescription for dealing with the loss of this moment. And many have instinctually understood that by looking for meaning during this particularly difficult time. Daniel, do we have time for another?
Yeah, I have time for one final question, Noam, before turning it back to you. This is from David Bachman on Zoom, who asked, have you found that your understanding and especially your experience of how prayer works or doesn't is different online than in person? What insights might you incorporate into your hearts and minds after the pandemic that might affect religious services or worship?
That
Rabbi
might
Wolpe?
be our rabbinic colleague, Rabbi David Bachman. David
I was
Wolpe.
going to say, yes, if this is David Bachman, the rabbi, hello there. It's been many years since we've had a chance to talk. But David, so here's what I would say. I respond to prayer by suggesting the following analogy, which started with Leone Medina, who was an Italian rabbi in the 1700s. He said, if you were standing on a shore and you watched a man pulling a boat to the shore and you were mistaken about mechanics and motion, you might think that the man was pulling the shore to the boat. He said, that's the mistake most of us make when we pray. We think we're pulling God to us. God, I want this. But in fact, what we're supposed to be doing is pulling ourselves to God. And that you can do online and in person. So in terms of the vertical response, I don't see much of a difference between Zoom and in person. But it's very hard to pull other people close to you on Zoom. It's just hard. It's not impossible. It's very hard, and you can't do it the same way. There's a part of the service in the Kedusha when we sing L'Dor Vador in my congregation when everybody puts their arms around everybody next to them. You can't do that with your computer. And that's a loss that is irreplaceable and should be irreplaceable. And I don't want that to be able to be replaced on Zoom. So my sort of paradoxical answer is we can do a lot and we can do things that you can't do in person, but I'm glad and grateful that there is a lack that people will feel because we need each other and we need each other in person.
Serene, how's prayer going for you?
Well, what a beautiful answer. Thank you, David. Two quick thoughts. One is that as I'm on Zoom worship services, it's one of those moments when repeating prayers that you have repeated for years has a powerful effect because you have a very visceral and living memory of what those prayers meant when you were together. And so, for instance, in my case, saying Christian Lord's Prayer, which I've spoken, since I was a child around the family table. When I speak that, I have the experience inside of myself of the many, many communities in which that has been spoken. And that's part of the value of prayers that become part of us. And I agree, prayer is a gift that God gives to us. It's not, the purpose of prayer is not for us to convince God of something, but actually for us to remember that God is with us. And that can happen in any form, anywhere, anytime.
Thank you both. I want to conclude with my own thought of gratitude. Of course, the gratitude that I have that two people who have so much to contribute to this topic agreed to come together with me and share what they have shared in their writing, in their persona, in their pastoring to me and many, many others over decades. You are the people we need to access. But the second level of gratitude is very symbolic. It seems to me that at a moment of great challenge for the American people, for humanity large, around the planet, we know that religious tradition can be a healer. It can be a significant part of making people feel better about their circumstances and having a path and a way. It's not an accident that AJC is so focused on interreligious relations and has invested time, resources for decades so that we could be drawn closer in this way, so that we can symbolize to others what it means for people of different places, perspectives, philosophies, identities, come together for the better of humanity. If the Jewish people have learned anything over time, it's that we cannot go it alone. That when we have had partners who are supportive, then the security and future of the Jewish people is better assured. That's what this moment can be about. And I think it's a hopeful and lasting message for the future. I thank you both for being good friends to me, to AJC, to the Jewish people, and to all who strive to embody the best of our religious principles. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you so much.
Daniel?
Thank you all for that fascinating and hopeful conversation. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and showing your commitment to the topics discussed here today. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is still bringing us together on the issues that matter. Please consider making a donation to AJC so we can continue building closer ties with other faith and ethnic communities and confronting common challenges. Visit ajc.org/donate. Our next Advocacy Anywhere program will be a conversation with His Excellency Luis Lacapo, President of Uruguay, and AJC Project Interchange alumnus. Uruguay is a long-standing strategic partner of the United States and Israel, and in February 2019 became the first Latin American country to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, working definition of anti-Semitism. This program will take place on Wednesday, May 20th at 12 p.m. Eastern. To register for this program and to stay up to date on all Advocacy Anywhere programs, please visit ajc.org/Advocacy Anywhere. Thank you again for joining us today. Please stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.
Goodbye.